Okay, well, welcome everybody to today's webinar. We have a couple different things today. First is an overview of the 2022 Water Resource Element Guidance Update, which includes best practices for integrating climate change adaptation and for identifying suitable receiving waters. And that will be our first half of the meeting of the webinar. And the second half is an interview with Arundel County focused on how they integrated climate change adaptation into their latest comprehensive plan, their general development plan, and specifically focusing on water resource planning. So as many of you know, the water resource element is a mandated chapter of local, both county and municipal comprehensive plans. And we've had guidance on the water resource element for about 15 years old. And what is new in this update is that we're providing checklists and best practices to both protect water resources as the local land use plan is both developed and implemented, so that it's consistent with the Maryland Department of the Environment's current water resources program, and also to integrate climate change considerations, particularly flooding risks, into the water resource element assessments. And these are assessments related to drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater. We've also transitioned our guidance from a type of paper PDF type version to a web-based version, which makes it a lot easier for us to update it to the latest tools and data sources that are out there to facilitate your development of your water resource element. Two aspects of the water resource element guidance are still the same, and we have links on the web page. This is to the drinking water assessment and wastewater assessment guidelines. Those from the original 2007 WRE guidelines are still current and should be followed. So importantly, what are the expectations from the Maryland Department of Environment and the Maryland Department of Planning of local governments as you move forward with considering and making updates to your water resource element? So there are checklists in the guidance document, and this presentation has links which we will, I'm going to put a couple of them in the chat, but keep in mind that we will share this presentation afterwards. When we upload it to our website, and there are links in the presentation itself. But I'm also putting links in the chat right now to the two checklists that we're asking local governments to use. Again, one of them is focused on the checklist for best practices to identify and protect suitable receiving waters. The other is a checklist of best practices to integrate climate change adaptation. And when the state reviews your draft water resource element, we're going to use these checklists to see how many of those you've addressed, and we'll basically be encouraging the use of those, each of those boxes in the checklist as much as possible. So this is a list of best practices. We recognize generally that we would like for the local governments to complete the necessary data compilation and analysis work, whether it's vulnerability assessments or estimates of costs for adaptation, ideally before a comprehensive plan update begins. But we recognize that if time, staff, and or financial resources are not available, that the water resource element should at least identify gaps in data analysis needs and resource needs before the next comp plan update. And those needs should be, and gaps should be discussed in the comprehensive plan itself. We want local governments to recognize that we have technical assistance available. There's, of course, the Water and Science Administration at the Maryland Department of the Environment. There's our Resource Conservation and Management Unit at Planning. At the Department of Natural Resources, there's the Maryland Geological Survey and the Chesapeake and Coastal Service. And our agencies can help to connect you to other groups, whether it's watershed groups, extension services, soil conservation districts, Maryland Department of Agriculture, and non-governmental organizations. So the next two slides, we wanted to give you a sense of whether you really needed to update your water resource element or not. And basically, there are some instances where you certainly, we would like for you to update your water resource element. So the first aspects have to do with climate change and flooding. If your current water resource element does not discuss climate change impacts to water resources, or it doesn't identify strategies to account for currently experienced or expected water-related climate change impacts, then we are expecting and hoping you will update your water resource element. From a flooding perspective, if the water resource element does not consider flood risks or identify local flood-prone watersheds, whether it's riverine or coastal, or if your land use plan does not consider the effects of developing your land use plan on subsequent flooding risks, again, we would like for you to update your water resource element to incorporate those aspects of climate change and flooding. Outside of climate change, with regard to identifying and protecting suitable receiving waters, if there's brand new water resource information, such as the TMDL status of your receiving waters, information about the quality or quantity of your receiving waters, whether the water quality is going down or not, information about whether your availability of water is changing significantly, whether it's from groundwater aquifers or whether it's from local streams you may be using water from. Like that would be an instance where you should relook at your water resource element to see if changes are needed. One of the major aspects of the water resource element is just considering whether the type of land use plan you're putting forward would be too much strain or not for your available drinking water and wastewater resources, or too much strain for your receiving waters. So if you have a very significant change to your land use plan, you may want to relook at the impacts of that to your water, sewer, and stormwater. And importantly, MDE standard guidance has always been if your water and sewer demand is likely to exceed 80% of your available wastewater capacity or drinking water appropriation, that would really be an important time to relook at your water resource element and your capacity plans. So at this point, I'm going to hand off the presentation to Matt. And Matt, I'll be glad to move slides forward as you need me to.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, mostly focus on the changes to the guidance that we made with respect to Maryland's water resources framework. One thing that's important to say, I mean, not only was the guidance old, but there have been some changes to Maryland's water resources program since the guidance was first developed. So for example, back in 06 or 07, when the first iteration of the guidance was developed, we were still under a voluntary framework for Chesapeake Bay restoration. For example, we were under the tributary strategies, a voluntary approach. It was pre-Bay TMDL. So that was one, big rationale for wanting to update the water resources element guidance. I'm not going to talk a lot about the climate piece. I think Jason spoke to that a little earlier in terms of, when you want to update your water resource element to include climate considerations. But also the statute that created the Climate Commission, I think it was a 2015 statute, also required state agencies to look at their plans and programs and make sure that climate change impacts like sea level rise, and it lists a number of factors in that statute. But essentially, that statute also compels state agencies to bring climate considerations into all their programs and plans and functions, essentially. So that was another reason, kind of we have a charge or a mandate to incorporate climate. So we wanted to update this water resources element too, to include climate considerations. So those were kind of the two big changes, since the last iteration that really drove the update to the guidance. Talking about the water resources side, so this graphic here shows really the kind of an overview, provides an overview of the Clean Water Act framework and really kind of the structure we were using to update the water resources element guidance. And really, if you look at this graphic, if you look at the white box up top where it says develop water quality standards, that's really where it all begins. So essentially, we wanted to use the guidance update as a mechanism for local planners to get familiar with the Clean Water Act framework, kind of understand what's entailed in each of these boxes in the process. So that starts with water quality standards, understanding what water quality standards apply, what water quality standards and criteria. So like if you're planning growth and development in a cold water trout stream watershed, we have temperature standards, for example, that you want to consider with that growth and development and how that's going to influence temperature. So knowing the water quality standards that apply where you're planning growth and development is something you want to understand, so that'll help maybe drive considerations in your planning process. You also want to understand what, once we have water quality standards, we monitor them in Maryland to see whether they're being attained. And if not, you need to develop a TMDL, or if we find those waters are actually higher quality watersheds that are in need of protection, we have like the anti-degradation or water quality protection process that we look at. So know the trajectory, not only know what standards apply, but know where your watersheds stand with respect to the water quality monitoring. If you're planning growth and development in an impaired watershed, what does the water quality data look like? Are you seeing improving trends in that area, or are you still seeing maybe declines in water quality that may suggest you want to consider additional controls with planned growth and development? We understand that just doing what's in your permit oftentimes isn't enough. So again, if you're seeing, I know with the Bay TMDL and with the Maryland's Phase 3 Watershed Implementation Plan, we took the approach, hey, just do what's in your permit. But and that should be enough if you're doing what's in your MS4 or within your NPDES permits. But sometimes because of the cumulative impacts or the level of development in the watershed, just using the Maryland's design manual or meeting the minimum requirements with respect to your permit, you're not seeing the water quality improve. So you want to consider that again, and how growth and development overlays with the trajectory of your water bodies, and whether you're really seeing the improvements you want to see or not, and again how that may influence additional local considerations you want to put into place with your growth and development. Again, whether you want to do more stormwater capture, things like that. So being familiar with the standards, the water quality, and whether it's under a TMDL. If it's a high quality watershed where you're planning growth and development, like one of our tier 2 watersheds, for example, it's kind of an analogous process. Look at what are the water quality trends in that area? Are your protection programs or your programmatic elements, maintaining that water quality or not, or are you seeing declining trends? And again, if you're seeing declines in those watersheds, even though you're meeting regulatory requirements, you still may want to consider doing more with your planned growth and development, so you don't continue to degrade those watersheds and get into a situation where there's more regulatory controls, or you have to do like a social and economic justification for new development. So those are things we want to be familiar with as you kind of the Clean Water Act framework, whether, again, you're in a high quality area or area that's under a TMDL, and then thinking about, where you are with your programs, what you're seeing with the trends in water quality. And again, that can help drive some local decisions as to, where you might want to do more than kind of the minimum that's required in your permit, or, the minimum state standards that are required for a particular project. So that's what this graphic tries in really general terms to kind of lay out. And if you go to the next slide, Jason. So yeah, we have hyperlinks to all those sections. So in the guidance, you'll see a description and links to like where you can find your water quality standards, the maps and resources that you need to understand these different components and how you might want to consider those when you're developing your local plan. Again, everything's linked here. We'll provide this presentation. You have all the hyperlinks to these sections that describe in more detail the Clean Water Act framework and the different considerations for that. Next slide. Also, there's other elements that are required in comp plan. There's a sensitive areas element. And usually in your sensitive areas, those are areas like wetlands or floodplains that deserve special protection. But we also encourage folks, when you're doing your resources, water resources element, part of the plan, also think about your sensitive areas element, because there's nexi between water resources and some of these sensitive areas. Like maybe, if you have greater protection of your wetlands or enhanced protection practices in your floodplains, those can help help you adapt to or help mitigate some of the maybe some flooding considerations that may come into play if you're having some development in local flood prone areas. Again, these sensitive, protecting the sensitive areas and using the sensitive areas element as a component can help mitigate the impacts of that plan growth and development and make sure that you're not exacerbating local flooding impacts with plan growth and development. So we want you to think about tying in and kind of leveraging your sensitive areas element and protection of those sensitive resources in that, if you're developing in areas that are more vulnerable to, say, climate or flood risks. We also have best practices in the guidance for how you can assess water hazard risk, kind of like gives you some procedural processes to go through and think about vulnerability assessments and how you can assess risk in certain areas. That's hopefully useful. You want to think about when you're updating your WRE, whether you want to kind of leverage some of the work you might be doing in your local hazard mitigation plans. So if some of this vulnerability assessment or local hazards have already been identified in your local hazard mitigation plans, you can reference that when you're updating your WRE. Maybe just provide links to those documents. But there may be other planning processes that you're going through that satisfy or already address some of your climate vulnerabilities that you can point to as really satisfying some of the climate considerations in this WRE guidance. And we also provide examples of climate change risk to water resources. There's links to tools like different sea level rise layers, things like that. We have a crab layer, which is our CoSmart layer that we use for identifying where projects are in more coastally vulnerable areas to climate, sea level rise and things like that. We have layers available that you can will help you identify where you may be planning growth and development in more climate vulnerable areas. And then there's different strategy approaches as well that are available in the guidance update that you can think about to help, again, mitigate either climate impacts or impacts to your receiving waters that may come about with local development. Can you go to the next slide? And then we also wanted a section in there, and this is very, I would say, high level, because I think a lot of us are still trying to navigate through, how what we do may impact, the most vulnerable communities, Black and Brown communities. So given that is really, on everyone's mind nowadays, and making sure that we plan growth and development, for example, in an equitable way, we wanted to have some discussion in the WRE update about that as well. So, if you're just think about that and use the opportunities where available in, your planning process to think about, for example, if you're doing planning some new growth and development next to vulnerable communities that maybe already are impacted or, by flooding, for example, or maybe there's lead service lines or something in those communities that, need to be replaced, and there's water quality issues, think about where there's opportunities to, uplift some of those communities or maybe deal with some of those legacy equity issues in local communities that are next to where you're having your planned growth or development. Think about opportunities of when you're putting infrastructure in for new development, how you may be able to also modernize infrastructure and take advantage of opportunities in adjacent communities that have been historically underserved. So it's there's a lot of room in there for being creative and finding solutions to bring equity to bear. But so think about that. Again, this is just kind of it's a fairly high level, but there's some examples we provided in the guidance of strategies that you can use and where equity considerations may come into play. Next slide, please. And then, this is just a slide talking about some of the outreach we want to do. This is an example of that, getting out, making sure people, know that there's just a new guidance available, that they should at least be considering climate, kind of some of these big drivers of the change and the reason we're updating the WRE and let folks know what that's about generally and what the expectations are. So these outreach efforts are part of that. Also, as we start to get in draft comp plans, MDE and MDP are talking about, how we want to coordinate our reviews of those plans to make sure that, we're working together and providing consistent feedback. So, we're here. Jason provided some of the list of the agencies that and the units that will be reviewing these plans, but we want to do that in a coordinated way too as they start to come in. So that's something we're certainly conscious about. And I think with that, I think this is the last slide. I think we just have our contact information. So again, fairly high level overview there, but we hope you find that helpful. And Jason, I think we're just transitioning right over to dialogue with the county, right, about how they went about integrating climate considerations into their local plan.
That's right. Yeah. And thanks so much, Matt. I'm going to introduce Eric Michaelson and Michael Stringer. I'm going to read their bios real quick, and then we'll start the interview of them. So Eric Michaelson is Deputy Director for Anne Arundel County's Department of Public Works, heading its Bureau of Watershed Protection and Restoration. His work he does is to facilitate the recovery of the Chesapeake Bay and its tributaries through supporting robust restoration projects and rigorous scientific monitoring efforts bolstered by diverse stakeholder partnerships. Eric has extensive background as a project manager for an environmental consultant, as the executive director for a nonprofit, the Arundel Rivers Federation, formerly the South River Federation, and has worked for Anne Arundel County since 2014 as the county builds up the environmental assessments, restoration implementation, and ecological evaluation to support the clean water obligations under the Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System, the MS4 permit, and the Chesapeake Bay Total Maximum Daily Load, TMDL, the Bay TMDL, that is. Michael Stringer is a senior planner in Anne Arundel County's Office of Planning and Zoning. He has more than 15 years of experience in community and environmental planning. He specializes in community engagement and planning for redevelopment and land conservation. He has helped communities develop award-winning plans for revitalization after structural economic changes and for resiliency to flooding and sea level rise. He has worked for nonprofit organizations, local government, and prior to joining Anne Arundel County, was a principal at a private consulting firm. He earned undergraduate degrees in English and environmental science at Rutgers University and has a master's degree in conservation biology and sustainable development from the University of Maryland. So welcome, Eric and Michael. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you for having us.
And of course,
Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, glad to be here. And so Matt and I are going to trade off our questions to you. And I think that I'm going to start with a broad question, which is, can you tell us how you both approached climate change considerations in the Anne Arundel County comprehensive planning process?
Okay, I'll take a stab at that one. For Anne Arundel County, this really emerged as an organic element of the planning process. The comprehensive plan built on integrated work across county departments. So to begin the process, we built an interdepartmental project team. And so we learned through the process the work that Bureau of Watersheds was doing around this space, the Department of Health looking at septic systems and rising sea levels and groundwater, that our Office of Emergency Management was doing around impacts of climate change related to flooding, evacuations, etc. We had those departments prepare briefing papers on different topics that needed to be addressed in the comprehensive plan, and then throughout the planning process, engage with them collaboratively to develop our goals, policies, and strategies. Now, I joined this planning process, in full disclosure, about halfway through it. And when I was brought on, I was asked to review the plan and look at considerations of sustainability and climate change. And as I analyzed the draft material that was already put together, I realized we were already touching on climate issues in multiple ways, from stormwater management to emergency response to our transportation systems. So that led to us taking an approach where we address climate change throughout the plan. Sort of like we did with equity as well, kind of taking this approach of, equity in all policies, a similar approach with climate across all elements of the comprehensive plan. So while we do have a specific climate goal and set of climate goals and policies and strategies, we also have woven them through the different elements of the plan. To help people kind of bring that all together, we actually created a separate page within our plan that kind of shows how those different elements get tied together. And I'll put a quick link to our comprehensive plan that we refer to as Plan 2040 in the chat there, if folks want to look at for future reference. Eric, is there anything you wanted to add to that, or?
Well, I think, again, a piece of this is that the county has been working on various watershed assessments or various assessments, like Michael said, over the course of the past 10 or 15 years. And that having that document, oftentimes sort of in disparate places, provided an opportunity for the planning and zoning staff to piggyback on that work that had been done and really sort of thread it together. I think a key component of this, and I think probably for everybody on this call, it is an overriding element, is that really the sort of political winds aligned about the time that this GDP was coming together, for there really to be a genuine focus on climate resilience and to begin to think about it in an integrated fashion. So while the department that I run had been focused on watershed assessments over the course of the past 10 or 15 years or so as a part of our MS4 permit, we've basically done those on the ground assessments of all of the watersheds in the county, completed them probably by about the 2018 timeframe. We had a huge amount of data and a huge amount of information on sort of the condition assessments of those watersheds. Public Works had also, we've got about 40,000 septic systems in Anne Arundel County. So that's been an issue that the Department of Public Works has been looking at really since probably the initiation of the TMDL, probably 2008, 2009, trying to figure out how do we get that nutrient load off of our local waterways. And so we've been looking at septic conversion plans, developed a septic sort of task force and put in place some legislation to make it a little easier to go from septic to public sewer. There's still lots of hurdles that we deal with there, but that's been an element that Public Works has been thinking about for a long time. The county put together about a decade ago their first sea level rise strategy. That's something now that Michael and Stacy Poulos with our Office of Planning and Zoning are both working on revisiting and bringing up to date. And I guess that one of the things I'll also mention is that, there are some of these older studies that are out there, and just the landscape, both figuratively and actually has changed so dramatically that a lot of these 10 or 15-year-old studies probably have sort of limited utility at this point. We've got much better remote sensing data that we can use to inform our decisions, from LiDAR to enhanced aerial photography to other things that in some respects make these analyses, I think, much easier now than they were then. They were much more labor intensive, I think, historically. And so looking at what the shortfalls are in those old data sets, I think is important in terms of being able to figure out what we need to update and complete. We've also been working with our Department of Highways, our Bureau of Highways within the Department of Public Works, who is really our first responder to a lot of these flooding issues. Of course, in Anne Arundel County and some of the other jurisdictions present, we've got not just non-tidal flooding, but also coastal flooding issues. And so we've worked with them to basically integrate the data from our watershed assessments with their sort of work order data that they've collected in terms of flooding complaints over the past several years to create a map of areas that are sort of known flooding problems or bottlenecks for flooding. And that in turn has informed a grant request that we recently pursued and received from FEMA to do a road vulnerability analysis for the county. There's about 30 sites throughout the county that are known non-tidal flooding issues. And one, we have a sense of where they are, but there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of figuring out what are the conceptual solutions, what's the cost of those solutions, how do we triage those instances, because it's going to be a ton of money to be able to address those issues, and then eventually to create a capital program that will roll those out and pursue those in a probably pretty deliberate fashion, I would say, over a course of several decades, realistically, just because the scope of the work is there. But because I would say the Office of Planning and Zoning and because the administration have finally gotten serious about recognizing this is an issue and something that's going to need to have resources addressed to it, we can now I still see them sort of as baby steps to really get our arms around what are the right solutions in terms of a capital effort, and what are the costs that are associated with those. And so that's something that we're really getting thick of now as well. One of the other things that I'll mention is, and I'm happy to share this with any of the jurisdictions that are present. Of course, the FEMA floodplain mapping is tremendously helpful to all of us. Anne Arundel County, I think, probably like most of the jurisdictions here, regulates its own set of 100-year floodplains above oftentimes the FEMA mapped areas. But one of the things that we've struggled with, and our land use agencies, primarily Office of Planning and Zoning and Department of Inspections and Permits, have really been at the mercy, I would say, of development engineers to provide accurate information in that regard where the FEMA mapping isn't done. So one of the things that we did within the Bureau of Watershed Protection and Restoration is had our GIS staff actually develop a model for where those 100-year floodplains probably exist up above the FEMA maps. Now, these are not regulatory, they're not perfect. I mean, we've both asked our land use agencies to beta test them essentially for us. But from my perspective, they give reviewers sort of a flagging mechanism to be able to do a little bit of ground truthing on those development applications as they come in, and hopefully to be able to keep development activities out of those otherwise flood prone areas. And so I think, like I say, we've developed a methodology to be able to create that remotely using topography data and hydrology data that I'd be happy to share. But I think that that's the kind of thing that I'm sure is going on in a variety of different jurisdictions. And I think to the extent to which we can share those advances with each other, that there's a really good opportunity for cost savings, as well as seeing what does work, what doesn't work, and advancing our land use planning based on those kinds of things. So that's my answer to the question. Happy to continue the conversation, Jason.
Yeah, thanks so much, Eric, and thanks, Michael. Matt, do you want to ask the next question?
Yeah, I think I think Eric spoke to a lot of this already, because the next question was, telling us about the analyses the county did to understand, potential impacts or worry, and you talked a lot about that, doing, some of the mapping that you did and the assessment work that you did. But Maybe, so I think Eric covered it, but maybe you can talk a little bit more. One thing you didn't get into was a resilience strategy, or I know you have a resilience authority now. Do you want to say anything about that, or any of the legislative kind of initiatives the county undertook?
Sure. Yeah, sure. I'll start off, and if Michael has additions, he can do that as well. So we did have a climate resilience work group that was comprised of county staff from the various agencies. Basically, really wrapped up right sort of before COVID hit. But the idea was, let's get a handle on, just sort of based on people's individual experience, what is the infrastructure that's vulnerable. And obviously this roadways piece was probably the biggest single element of it, but we talked with our utilities people about where are their pumping stations, or where is their water and sewer infrastructure that might be at risk as a result of sea level rise or climate change. We talked with our Department of Education folks because, and one of the interesting things that came out of it was that the schools, or we have a school that is basically sort of a relief or emergency center in the county, as a if there's some kind of event that occurs, and probably what the county needs to have more locations in place for emergency relief centers, and probably to be able to provide them with the equipment or resources or materials and staffing that they would need should a situation like that arise. So it was an opportunity to really take a deep look at those various shortcomings or vulnerabilities. When the group ended, we sort of went in two different directions, and one was, I would say, sort of a policy direction, and that a lot of those sort of policy recommendations or conversations have been circling around the things that planning and zoning has done, and then sort of an implementation side, which has really been led by Public Works to figure out, again, where is that infrastructure vulnerability, and how will Public Works pursue efforts to address those kinds of things. And so, Matt, the question about the Resilience Authority that was created in terms of Annapolis and Anne Arundel County is that becomes sort of this third-party quasi-governmental entity, really, as I see it, to help prioritize some of that infrastructure investment, and also really to help procure outside funding, either from the state or federal government or other sources, to help make those projects become a reality. And so that's just really gotten off the ground in the last couple months. There's an interim director who's been appointed, but the idea there is that they'd work very closely with county staff to help see some of these projects realized.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, I think the next question is probably for Michael to begin with, which is, it sounds like the comp plan, obviously through our last discussion, the comp plan certainly was benefited by a number of previous technical studies. And as Eric was just saying, collaborative work among county departments. That said, there's also obviously public involvement, which is a central component of comp planning. How was the public engaged on climate issues as you developed the general development plan update?
Yeah, I'll take that. That is, as you said, a fundamental part of how we approach comprehensive planning. And it's been interesting to see, over the course of my career, the public conversation around this issue has changed dramatically. When I first started working, we couldn't talk about these topics in mixed company. And now I think there's been much more broad understanding of the present impacts. When we have events like last Halloween, we had significant coastal flooding that impacted areas around the county. And we've learned, I think, to be more sophisticated in our framing of the conversation, to talk more about proximate impacts like flooding or heat waves, and to talk about how things have changed and how we can be resilient to that. I think those terms and that framing is a lot more acceptable to a broader group of people in our community. That being said, we were able to go above and beyond what had previously been done in any previous general development plan in the county in terms of our public engagement. Beginning back in late 2018, and when we could actually have in-person meetings, having a series of 8 listening sessions and 17 visioning sessions, where we gathered with groups of people around the county to ask them about what they loved about their community, what they wish they could see improved, what they wanted to see their future look like, and establishing a citizens advisory committee of 23 members that met with us, on a almost twice a month basis during the real crucible time of developing the policies and strategies of the document. And then, of course, we had to switch and learn how to adapt to online meetings when the pandemic hit. And that, in some ways, I think, helped foster innovation in our approaches as well, using more online tools, web maps, story maps to be able to describe to the public the issues, as well as allow them to engage with things like planned land use maps that typically in the past you would just put a poster board up on a wall and put some sticky dots or post notes on it. With the online platforms, we could allow them to zoom in much more closer and take a more detailed look at things. And that actually enabled us to expand the outreach as well. So whereas we might get a couple dozen people at an evening meeting, when we went online, we were getting over 4,000 people visiting our online open house website, generating over 1,500 comments. And through all of that, environmental issues always came as one of the top 3 issues. For our citizens, it's always traffic, schools, and the environment as kind of the top 3 that come out. And interestingly, as we move through our review process, we as staff kind of taking together that body of work that Eric was describing, we're really integrating in climate resilience into the plan. And that was getting a lot of support from our environmental advocates in the community. And importantly, when we brought our plan to our planning advisory board, several of their members made really encouraging statements to actually even push us to strengthen and be more progressive in this language, especially around things like greenhouse gas reduction, electrification, building codes, electric vehicles. And so with that support, we actually were able to even strengthen some of these policies before it then went to county council. And county council, they had a lot of things to say about a lot of parts of the plan, but the climate piece, they pretty much left alone. I think they broadly understood that the issue was important. Anne Arundel County really prides itself as a coastal community with our over 500 miles of shoreline. So policies around, resilience to sea level rise, and looking at issues of where we can reduce our own facilities energy use and support renewables on things like closed landfills. These are ideas that got broad support from our council across the board. So overall, we walked through the public with this process, and their input, including the input from our appointed boards, helped strengthen the response to climate in the plan.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, Matt, do you want to take the next question?
Sure. No, and that was really interesting, with COVID and how that actually, facilitated more engagement, I guess, and maybe a more robust public process. I think that's just an interesting observation, and we've seen some of that. I mean, this meeting's just an example. With some of these online tools, there's trade-offs, but the ability to collaborate, better now. I think we've really COVID really advanced us all, so that's interesting to hear those perspectives. But I wanted to maybe get into more specifics around about the water resources element specifically, and if you can talk about how climate considerations were incorporated into your water resources element component of the plan.
Sure. So for us, and for me in particular, again, in public works, we're really focused on the stormwater issues, and traditionally had been focused primarily on the water quality issues associated with the MS4 permit. But growing increasingly, we really are involved in these conveyance issues. We're also working collaboratively with these other land use agencies to try to make sure that the impacts of new development, and I think again, like a fairly well developed community, or in the sense that most of the development in the county has already occurred in large parts of it. We're at the point now where the lots oftentimes that are being developed were problematic, or there was some kind of encumbrance or other issue that prevented them from being developed at a prior point in time. And so as they get developed, either because they've provided some kind of de facto stormwater management function previously, or because they've got wetlands or other kinds of encumbrances, as they get developed, we increasingly see lots and lots of concerns on the part of the public, both from folks who are maybe downstream or adjacent neighbors. And also, oftentimes we see people who move into those, in the case of residential properties, into those residential developments, complaining about water issues after a couple of years of being in those communities. And so, one of the things that we've really taken a close look at, and this is development review is handled by our inspections and permits department, but we work closely with them, and we're involved in efforts to try to tighten up the stormwater management standards. I'm the A-Storm representative or one of the A-Storm representatives for MACO, working with MDE in terms of reviewing and revisiting some of those quantity management standards, given more intense precipitation and that sort of thing that we're seeing. And so trying to make sure that the regulations are keeping up with the on the ground precipitation conditions that we're seeing, and also exploring things like, do we need to tighten those standards with the sort of ESD to the MEP regulations. There was a real heavy focus on that, managing that first inch of runoff, but there's a lot of thought that perhaps we need to be focused on some of these bigger storms in terms of controlling them or managing them or creating corridors of management for them going forward. So we were able to integrate some of that language in terms of revisiting these standards in the Plan 2040. And we've also, one of the things I'll mention that Anne Arundel County has done is we've created, we call it a stormwater strike team. Basically, it's a number of staff in inspections and permits and a staff from my bureau, basically, who are giving an additional set of reviews, both on the front end of development projects to make sure that issues don't exist already on those properties that are being developed, and then sort of following them through the development process to see if we do encounter issues, particularly with regards to flooding or downstream erosion, how can we work cooperatively with the developers to get those issues addressed before they're out from under their bond, and make sure that the community is protected while those efforts go forward. I can only assume that maybe Anne Arundel County's experience is similar in that a lot of the development review staff, both I think at planning and zoning and inspections and permits, oftentimes don't get to lay eyes on the physical sites that are being developed, and that comes at a cost, I think, in terms of the ability to protect the adjacent properties and also the natural resources that often occur. We have had some additional staffing in both those agencies over the course of the past couple of years that's really tightened that up. But I think what people found was, once we started giving that the attention that it really deserved, that there was a lot that was falling through the cracks in terms of wetland or stream identification or potential instabilities or flooding issues. And so we're really taking steps, I think, in the right direction to be able to address those. But it does come at an increased staffing cost. But I think that there's a tremendous value to being able to give these things the attention that they deserve. And it doesn't necessarily have to slow the development process down. I think if there's more certainty and more steadfastness, I would say, upfront from the review agencies, and a clear standard for what needs to be accomplished, that better plan sets are going to come into those review agencies, and hopefully have an expedited review, or have less need for various iterations of review that saves time and money on both sides.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, my next question is for Mike, which you talked about already, that the county has over 500 miles of shoreline, and as many folks know, there's a series of large peninsulas and necks since the Chesapeake Bay. Looking at, we talked a little bit about this, but can you tell us a little bit more about how you addressed not only flood risk but also sea level rise in the comp plan, and whether it's including particular policies and strategies that you've incorporated into the comp plan?
Yeah. As was mentioned, the county conducted a sea level rise assessment back in 2011, looking at a couple different scenarios of 2 feet and 5 feet of sea level rise, just in a simple bathtub model, looking at what those elevations would do. And that provided us a nice ability to be able to convey and quantify what potential impacts were. With 2 feet of sea level rise, which is squarely in the projections of what's considered likely by the state's recent 2018 forecast report and NOAA's 2022 update this year, that would impact approximately 2,000 acres of land in the county with an assessed value of approximately $2.9 billion. So really starting to see the expansive potential for impacts, especially in the southern part of our county. So we're able to use those numbers, use a lot. There's so many mapping tools now, like the Eastern Shore Regional GIS Collaborative has put together, Maryland State Highway Administration is using tools built by them to be able to convey, visualize for the public what those potential impacts could be. So as we thought about those, we were able to work with, other departments and thinking about understanding where those flood risks are, as Eric mentioned, be able to build in policies specifically around roads and bridges to make sure that we're assessing and looking at design solutions for those. Looking at land use policies for our peninsulas to make sure that we're putting the policy framework into the GDP that's forward thinking ahead about reducing risk of those low-lying areas. And making sure that our Office of Emergency Management is considering evacuation routes. And that's been a key issue that gets brought up, especially on our peninsulas where folks have usually one road in, one road out. If that road gets is pinched as a bottleneck for flooding, and that becomes a significant public health concern. So we were able to kind of, again, take that data from those previous studies and put that policy framework into place that then supports us when we come time for capital budget and more detailed planning to know that framework's already in the comprehensive plan to support it.
And Jason, one of the things I'll mention is that we put a couple of or several policies into recommendations into the GDP that we believe are consistent with trying to adapt for climate resilience. One of them is that we have a policy actually that we've already realized in terms of creating property tax credits for living shorelines that are installed by private property owners. That's there's a benefit there, obviously, in terms of climate resilience. There's also an MS4 benefit in terms of that work that we've been able to prioritize or incentivize. And we also, a couple of years ago, created a flood-prone property acquisition program that we ran through the Chesapeake Bay Trust, but it was focused on the acquisition of non-title properties that were subject to repeated flooding and that were areas, in the case at least of our first award, areas that probably really never should have been developed in the first place, and that where we can purchase the property, demolish the structure, and convert the area back to a natural resource location that in some cases can provide us some additional stormwater management benefits and get us out of the situation of having to respond with an expensive engineering solution that may not even be a complete fix. That's one of the things that we find a lot of times is that folks come sometimes into these communities that have experienced flooding issues for a number of years, maybe from areas where that hasn't been a problem. And there's sort of a public expectation that the county will be able to engineer the way out of low-lying areas with high groundwater tables with very little relief. And what we find ourselves is just trying to, it's a sort of almost an ameliorative strategy where we're trying to figure out how do we educate people and accommodate sort of dealing with these circumstances where there really is no great engineering solution to address them. And we particularly see that in communities that experience coastal flooding that are very low lying. And so a lot of this, I think, on all of our parts is going to be sort of expectation setting in terms of what can be accomplished, what can't be accomplished over the next several decades, and how do we triage the limited resources that we have to be able to address or retreat or whatever the potential solution is in the location we're looking at.
Thanks, Eric. Matt, do you want to ask the next question?
Sure. And there's clearly a lot that the county's doing in terms of integrating climate considerations into your general development plan, and you spoke about the WRE a little bit as well, and how that's been climate considerations have been integrated there. What do you all see? Having said that, what do you all see as any maybe gaps that you notice through the process, or Eric, you described a few of the challenges, but, maybe other challenges you wish you were able to address, or maybe future considerations, things that you really want to focus on in the future.
Yeah, I think this the A Storm effort with MDE. Looking forward to seeing if that is able to bear fruit in terms of maybe changing the regulations around new development activities. But I think to a large extent, both with local and state regulations, a lot of the new development activities that are occurring are held to a pretty good standard, and there's steps being taken to protect that. I think one of the things I struggle with, and one of the frustrations I have, is that a lot of the places that we see flooding issues in now are areas that, if we had contemporary rules in place 50 years ago, likely would not have been developed, or would have been developed in a much more restricted way. And so the question becomes, how do local jurisdictions handle these flooding concerns that have arisen in areas that are located in mapped 100-year floodplains now, or areas that are likely to be very vulnerable as there's any increases in sea level rise. And so, I think that's where we have to get creative about, what are some of the other tools, new tools that we can put into our toolbox to be able to address these concerns, and obviously making sure that new development isn't exacerbating those things any. But I think this issue of sort of the historical development that's occurred in our communities is going to be one that we're all going to struggle with, and try to look for workable solutions on as we move forward, because I don't really think there's any easy answers on that front.
Yeah, thank you. And you spoke to it earlier too. I know something that we think about, it's a conveyance, kind of like you're talking about the older infrastructure, or if there's undersized culverts, and that can be a bottleneck in the system as well, that it can be really difficult to, go back and fix. So Jason, I think it's back to you maybe for the last question.
Yes, and yeah, folks, we're going to probably just stick around for just maybe 10, 15 more minutes. So you're welcome, obviously, to hold on. Our interviewees have agreed to stay on, and we may even have a chance to ask them one or two end questions. So our last question really now is the implementation approach, which Eric, you mentioned a bit about. And now that the comp plan is adopted, the newest version of the GDP, can you talk to us about how the county is approaching implementation? And yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, be happy to. And I think in many ways, as we began this process, we began with the end in mind. Like so many plans, our previous general development plan gets critiqued as saying, oh, it went on the shelf after it was adopted and wasn't implemented. So we want to be very upfront with implementation. So in the plan, we've created an extensive matrix that lists every goal, policy, and strategy, who the lead department is, who's supporting in that, what's the time frame for implementation. And we've committed ourselves to preparing an annual progress report. And actually, the first one was just published in May. And so we're going through and tracking each individual, of the 400 plus strategies in the document, what's their status, and a brief snippet of information and links for more details for the public to see. And it's been great, I think, with this framework and with this timing, as Eric said, there's a lot of stars aligning right now, that we've got a lot of great partnerships that have been building up for the last several years with this work. So, for example, right now, the city of Annapolis and the U.S. Navy are working on a military installation resilience review that's looking at sea level rise risk around the Annapolis area, and the county is fully participating in that. And Eric also mentioned, that we're taking advantage of FEMA's BRIC grants to look for funding to move a lot of these projects forward. As we mentioned, the southern part of our county is in particular kind of the most prone as a low-lying coastal area. So we've got application in for a more detailed feasibility study of what are potential options to mitigate that, and that'll weave right into our community-based planning that will be beginning in that area of the county next year as well.
That's great. And Eric, do you have anything to add on that?
The only thing I would say is, again, like Michael has mentioned, I think the interesting thing about the environment that we're in now is that there are lots of people who are exploring these issues or sort of issues that are ancillary to these. I mean, one of the things that we've been able to do is work with sort of parallel to our sea level rise work is work with DNR, and they're working with George Mason University to look at sort of the potential resilience of coastal structures. So the county had been pursuing some innovative dredge material reuse efforts and has had those conceptually banging around for a little while and has talked to MDE about them. But there was an opportunity for us to sort of work with George Mason and DNR to say, okay, well, you all are looking at this, sort of how does sea level rise behave? What are the impacts to the land, the nearshore land, and what might be the impacts of some of these dredge containment structures that we're talking about creating? And so there are lots of opportunities out there. I know all of us, sometimes having the bandwidth to be able to take those on can be a little bit of a challenge. But I would say it's a good opportunity where if you sort of keep your mind open to collaboration or to information or networks that are out there to really get some good leverage, some good bang for your buck, maybe with some of these research institutions or others who are doing work to try to better understand what the impacts of these kinds of things are. I mean, my attitude is, from a stormwater perspective, is always I love having academics or consultants studying our projects for free, because that's information that we can take away and learn from. And it makes their lives a little easier if they've got cooperative jurisdictions to work with. So I would just say, if you've got the capacity for it, keeping your mind open to those opportunities is a real good thing to do in this environment as well.
Thanks, Eric. Matt, did you have any follow-up questions for Eric or Michael before we open the floor to anybody else for the last couple of minutes?
No, I think let's open it up and see if folks have questions.
Yeah, folks, feel free just to raise your hand using the hand raising chat, and hand raising function. I can just take people's questions if you have any. So up to you. And don't be shy, but if you are, it's okay. And maybe if we can then just have any last thoughts from Michael or Eric to wrap up the webinar.
I don't have any other thoughts other than I do think the idea of interjurisdictional collaboration, lessons learned, sharing those kinds of things. We do a lot of that on the MS4 stormwater side. And I think probably there's a value to that, both on the GDP development side, particularly with regards to water resources, but also these climate resiliency decisions. There's a lot going on elsewhere in the state, and I think it's always good to be aware of that and plugged in. And like I say, to the extent that we can share lessons learned or share resources, we're always happy to do that.
Thanks, Eric. I do see that Mark Szymborski with Montgomery County Planning has raised his hand. Mark, do you want to ask your question?
Yes. As part of the comp plan update, did you update your water resources element? Probably not, unless you got the guidance in time to do that, which doesn't seem likely. Or are you planning to do that as a follow-on to your adoption of your general plan?
Yeah, I can take a first stab at that, and Eric, you can follow up. We did update. We were ahead of this guidance, so that was not available for us to be able to use before we brought ours before our council. But we did, run the fundamental models behind it for water, sewer, and stormwater based on our updated planned land use map to look at what our build-out scenarios and implications of that were for those different water resources.
Yeah, if there's a need to update the water resources element, we would work collaboratively with planning and zoning to do any additional work that has to happen there. And as Michael points out, we've done a lot of that work in the lead up to the general development plan. But if there are additional requirements as a result of the new guidance, we'll work cooperatively with them to do that as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just jump in, Mark, and just to say that we do see a lot of the aspects that we were looking for in the Anne Arundel County General Development Plan, and in the not only in the plan itself, but also all the background work that Michael and Eric have described today. That's a lot of that background work is what we're also envisioning counties and municipalities to try to do to inform policy recommendations, for example, that are listed in the GDP of Anne Arundel County.
Jason, one thing I just want to mention, because Amalia from Calvert County mentions the Anne Arundel County Watershed Stewards Academy, and it's a good point. So we have a nonprofit organization called the Anne Arundel County Watershed Stewards Academy, and I know several other jurisdictions have outgrowths of that as well. But it's been a really important tool for the education of the public, both in terms of stormwater, water quality issues, but then these conveyance issues, and also getting access and connections with local communities and neighborhoods and religious institutions who are interested in doing this kind of work. So I'm going to put a link to their website in the chat, but if there are other folks who are interested, you can reach out to me about that. We're generous supporters of that program through our MS4 efforts as well. They handle a lot of our MS4 educational efforts, but they're helpful in terms of reaching out to the community for sure.
Thanks, Eric. And Michael, did you have any last words to say to wrap up the webinar?
I don't know, just thank you for your time. And we've learned a lot from other jurisdictions like Montgomery and Prince George's and others around us that have taken, I think, a lot more further steps in some of this climate planning that Anne Arundel had, and it's been really appreciate the opportunity to look at what other counties are doing, learn from examples, and see where we can share information. So if you all have any questions that we could potentially help out with, as Eric said, in the future, feel free to contact us directly.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your experience. I think it's been very helpful and going to be a resource to folks. So thank you all so much.
Yeah, and thanks everybody for participating today in the webinar. We hope you found it useful. We will be posting a recording of the webinar on our training resources section of the WRE guidance update. And with that, we'll adjourn the meeting, and thanks again.
Are you going to post the presentation on your webpage, Jason?
Yes, we can do that as well. Yeah. Thank you so much.